Order, members. The next item of business is a legislative consent motion relating to the Consumer Rights Bill. And I would ask the Clerk to please read the motion.
That this Assembly endorses the principle of the extension to Northern Ireland of the Consumer Rights Bill.
And I call the Minister for Health, Minister of Enterprise, Trade and Investment. Apologise, Minister. Minister.
Yes, I'm very glad to be the Minister of Enterprise, Trade and Investment. Mr Speaker, the Consumer Rights Bill was introduced into Parliament on the 23rd of January 2014, and it is intended to amend or extend existing UK-wide consumer and competition legislation. The primary aim is to make it easier for consumers to understand and to access their key rights in relation to quality goods and services. The bill will do this by consolidating into one piece of legislation key consumer rights covering goods, services, digital content such as e-books and software, and the law relating to unfair terms in consumer contracts. These existing rights are currently contained in 8 separate pieces of legislation. The bill will therefore address one of the major problems with the existing law, that it is overly complex, making it difficult to understand. And this complexity creates confusion which causes detriment for both consumers and businesses, as it results in unnecessary and time-consuming disputes. As part of this consolidation of consumer rights, the bill will also implement the remaining provisions of the Consumer Rights Directive. The Directive's other provisions have already been implemented by 2 sets of UK-wide regulations. The bill will also create clarity by being more prescriptive as to how long certain rights will continue to exist, rather than leaving this to be decided on the circumstances of each individual case. The bill will introduce a right to reject goods that are not of satisfactory quality up to 30 days, removing the current uncertainty. After 30 days, traders can offer a repair, which, if unsuccessful, rekindles the right to reject. In addition, the bill will make it easier for consumers and for small and medium-sized enterprises to challenge anti-competitive behaviour through the Competition Appeal Tribunal. The bill consolidates the enforcement powers used by trading standards departments to investigate breaches of consumer law, which are currently contained in around 60 pieces of legislation. And it will also give the civil courts and public enforcers greater flexibility to take the most appropriate action for consumers when dealing with breaches or potential breaches of consumer law. The bill's provisions have been drafted as a result of extensive research and after an exhaustive consultation process. This process started back in 2008, when the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills launched a call for evidence on the need to reform UK consumer law. This was followed by 3 separate consultations on various aspects of the bill. Northern Ireland was included in all of these consultations, and a response was provided by the Consumer Council for Northern Ireland, which supported the intention to simplify and clarify consumer rights. Independent research was also commissioned to provide empirical evidence as to the reality of business practices in relation to consumer rights. This involved an initial sample of 1,000 businesses and was followed up with interviews with a smaller sample of those businesses. A draft bill was published in June of last year, bringing together the various proposals included in the previous consultations. The proposals in the bill have been welcomed by business and consumer groups alike across the UK, including the Northern Ireland Consumer Council. The benefit for consumers is quicker and equitable resolution of their disputes. For businesses, it will mean that less time and resources will be employed in trying to resolve consumer disputes and reduce the potential loss of goodwill that such disputes can cause. Additionally, businesses will ultimately benefit from the opportunities for growth that increased consumer confidence will help to create. Most of the bill's provisions deal with a range of transferred matters, apart from those dealing with competition matters. However, all of the legislation dealing with consumer rights that will be amended by the bill have been made on a UK-wide basis. I consider that it is in the best interest of Northern Ireland consumers that the legislation setting out their rights to quality goods and services is no more complex than it needs to be. Enshrining these rights in one statute, as opposed to the current 8 pieces of legislation, is a major step forward in reducing the current complexity. It is important that consumers and businesses in Northern Ireland should benefit from these changes at the same time as their counterparts in Great Britain, given the increasing growth in internet retailing and the growth in retail outlets with branches across the UK. Including Northern Ireland in the provisions of the bill will mean that the objective of clarifying and simplifying consumer rights will be shared by consumers and businesses across the United Kingdom. I therefore commend this motion to the Assembly.
Mr. Stephen Agnew, and understand the member is speaking on behalf of the Enterprise Trade and Investment Committee.
That's right, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I welcome the opportunity to speak on today's debate on behalf of the Committee for Enterprise, Trade and Investment. At its meeting on the 16th of January 2014, the Committee considered an update from the Minister on the progress of the Consumer Rights Bill, which was published in June 2013. The Minister advised that a legislative consent motion would be required for the provisions of the bill, which is designed to make markets work better and reduce regulatory burdens for business. As consumer law is a devolved matter, the Committee wrote to the Minister seeking the rationale for bringing the legislation through via legislative consent motion rather than legislating in the Northern Ireland Assembly. On the 6th of February 2014, the Committee considered the Minister's response, advising that the proposed approach would be of more benefit to consumers in Northern Ireland than introducing separate legislation through the Assembly. The Bill's provisions cover both reserved and transferred matters. Therefore, any Northern Ireland legislation could only replicate the parts of the Bill that fall in the transferred field, and separate legislation would confuse consumers and would undermine one of the principal aims of the Bill, that of having all consumer rights in relation to goods and services within one statute. The Minister further advised that any delay in introducing Northern Ireland legislation would be disadvantageous to Northern Ireland consumers. The Committee explored these issues further during an oral briefing from DETI officials on the 20th of February 2014. Officials clarified that the bill was an opportunity to consolidate legislation, rectify weaknesses regarding downloaded content, and clarify how consumers can get redress when purchasing goods or services. Officials also informed the Committee that during the consultation phase for the bill, no issues were identified that were peculiar to the needs of businesses or consumers in Northern Ireland. Mr. Speaker, as part of its deliberations, the Committee also considered correspondence from the Consumer Council at its meeting on the 27th of February. The Consumer Council advised that it welcomes the bill and its intention to simplify and clarify the law for consumers. The Consumer Council also advocated an effective information campaign to ensure that consumers are aware of the rights and remedies available. The Minister may be in a position to inform the Assembly of any proposals to increase awareness of the Bill's provisions. In conclusion, having considered all the evidence, the Committee agreed to support DETI in seeking the Assembly's agreement to the UK Parliament considering provisions of the Consumer Rights Bill. The Committee agreed its report outlining its position. This report was circulated to all members and published on the Committee webpage. Mr. Speaker, the Committee supports the motion. And just if I could speak very briefly as an individual member of the Committee, thank you, Mr. Speaker, as a representative of the Green Party, just very briefly like to say that in my time in the Committee, I think in recent times the Committee has increased its scrutiny of legislative consent motions and other regulation that comes before the Committee. I think failure to scrutinise legislation fully would be a failure of the role of us as Assembly members, as legislators, and the role of the Committee as a scrutiny body. I would ask the Minister and our Department to work with us in this regard and to provide information up front that will facilitate speedy deliberation from the Committee, and I look forward to working with the Minister in this regard.
Fergal McKinney. Mr. McKinney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the opportunity to contribute today and do so in my capacity as a member of the Enterprise, Trade and Investment Committee. As we've heard, the draft form of this bill was published in June 2013, and the overall spirit is one that the SDLP agrees with to promote efficiency within markets and reduce the regulatory burden for business. 60 pieces of legislation into one, Mr. Speaker, is an admirable change and one that we in the Committee support, making as it does it easier to both understand and access for the consumer. The bill will provide for faster compensation for the consumer whenever they have been wronged under competition law. Mr Speaker, this bill has an important function, and that is to simplify the law so that the rights and responsibilities of the consumer are clear. And as Mr Agnew has pointed out, in terms of what the Consumer Council is saying, that consumer proficiency is extremely important in this regard. The bill, while technical, will help to make often daunting compensation procedures simpler, more cost-effective and more accessible. And in conclusion, Mr Speaker, the SDLP supports the Consumer Rights Bill legislative consent motion. Thank you.
Mr McLaughlin.
John Kohler. I also will be supporting this on behalf of my party. This Assembly, dealing with matters, will very often deal with legislation that perhaps at times overlaps or duplicates what's done elsewhere, and with no great improvement or difference. I think there's also opportunity to stamp our own personality on legislation, and for that reason I come somewhat reluctantly to the issue of legislative consent. But in this instance I think it's a pragmatic and efficient response, given that there's an overlap between what are devolved matters and issues which are not transferred, and it would be altogether too complicated to expect consumers to be able to understand the full kind of suite of rights and entitlements that they have. So in this instance I think the Minister has brought forward an entirely sensible proposition which we are supporting.
I call on the Minister to respond. Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the members who have spoken, Mr Agnew on behalf of the committee and the other members on their own behalf. I think this is a pragmatic way of dealing with the issues, because it would be unacceptable if consumers were confused about what rights they were able to access and deal with in Northern Ireland if we were to go our own way. And I think the legislative consent motion means that we have a very clear agenda in terms of consumers' rights and for businesses' responsibilities, and therefore I think I welcome the fact that the members have indicated their support for this motion today. 8 pieces of legislation are now going to be consolidated into one piece of legislation, and I think from my point of view in relation to better regulation, that's a very good move forward. And indeed I had the opportunity to discuss issues such as these with Lord Curry of our red tape review just yesterday. So it's something that I feel we need to be doing more of. So, Mr Speaker, I very much thank the members for their queries in the committee. They raised very sensible queries. We were able to deal with them, as indeed were the Consumer Council, and I hope that everyone understands that this is a good motion to bring before the House, and I commend the motion to the House.
Order, members. I want to advise the House we don't have a quorum in the House, so I can't put the question, so we'll ring the division bells. Order, members. The question on the motion standing in the order will be agreed. All those in favour say aye. Contrary, if any noes, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, members. The Business Committee has arranged to meet immediately after lunchtime suspension today. I propose, therefore, by leave of the Assembly, to suspend the sitting until 2 p.m. The first item of business when we return will be question time. The sitting is by leave suspended.